So it's my privilege to introduce Nigel, na mai haere mai kai kōrero matua Nigel Latta. I checked Nigel's website for his bio and it said Nigel was born. This was definitely the beginning of it all. He was a child for ages before steadily increasing height forced him to take up adult life. And he's done a bunch of stuff since then and is still alive today. So I love that. But to add some detail to the bunch of stuff, this included being trained as a clinical psychologist, working over 2 decades in the areas of forensic psychology and family therapy. In 2010, as a result of his passion for science and science education, Nigel was invited to become an associate of the world-leading multidisciplinary health and development study at the University of Otago. In 2012, he was made an officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit for services to psychology. He's written 8 books, which have now been published in 19 countries and 10 languages. His television career has spanned almost a decade, and he's presented a number of series. When I asked him for a quote for the day, he said, "Life can be stressful enough at the best of times. If you add a global pandemic and on top of celiac disease, that's a heavy load. My view is always issues are complicated. Doesn't mean navigating your way through them has to be. My experience has always been that small, simple steps get you through most things in life." So, tēnā koe, Nigel. We're very excited to hear your presentation and welcome.
Thank you. I should take the longer bio off because I put the short one up there in the hope that it will just dissuade anyone from actually reading out the longer one. So I've definitely got to take the longer one off. All right. Do you know what I might just start doing is making up some stuff because people just read it out. No one fact checks it. I'm going to put some stuff in there about how basically I spent 15 years in Africa working in aid camps, discovered fusion energy. People will just read it out. You know what? I'm actually going to do that. Right. But I digress. So now I have some questions. What I want to do is talk for a little bit just about some general stuff. And I have some questions that have already been sent through, things that people are dealing with. And I have the chat function up here so I can see people's questions if they want to throw those up. So yeah, I thought I'd just talk for a bit. And then we'll get into some questions because there are some quite good questions already. So yeah. I mean, I think just being a human is hard enough. Just even if everything is fine, just being a human in the world is hard enough. And then, you know, we have the whole COVID thing that gets chucked in on top of that. And celiac is this thing that for those of us who haven't really brushed up against the celiac, well, I guess, you know, you have because lots of people with it, but in terms of my understanding of the issues for people with celiac, you know it's a thing, like you hear about it, but you don't really stop and think about all of the implications for people who have celiac and for kids who have celiac and families who have to deal with that kind of stuff. And so there's an extra load, obviously, that people have to bear. The way forward for most things, though, is kind of the same. So in terms of parenting stuff, the most important thing is, it's interesting, over the last probably, I don't know, 15 years, we used to talk a lot about behavior, you know, behavior management and techniques to manage behavior and all that kind of stuff. Increasingly, now people are talking about relationship and things like temperament and understanding your kid's temperament because temperament is kind of the hub of everything, really. So temperament has a genetic component, and it's also influenced by the stuff that we encounter in our life as well. So temperament it's kind of like this, I think, how you go about doing the 2 kids might build a block tower. The block tower falls over. One kid gets really upset, and the other one just shrugs it off and builds it up again. Or maybe the block tower keeps falling over because the base of the block tower isn't right, but the kid building it just wants to keep doing it his or her way. So that's kind of temperament. Temperament isn't what you do, it's how you go about doing things. And so the more as a parent that you understand your kid's temperament, the easier it will be to help them to deal with stuff. So it's things like some kids are just more intense about stuff. They tend to react more intensely. They feel things more intensely. Some kids are really adaptable and some kids are less adaptable. You know, some kids can just pivot and other kids, it takes them a while to change from doing one thing to another thing. Some kids are really what we call persistent, which is a nice way of saying kind of stubborn, in the sense that persistent kids, they have a way of doing things and it's their way and they want to do it their way. And so, and there's a whole bunch of things. There's the extrovert thing, which is also a really important thing, I think, for parents to understand. You know, some people get their batteries charged from being around other people, and other people get their batteries drained by being around other people. I am by nature, personally, I'm an introvert. So I found the lockdown, it was okay. It was fine. But there's a woman up the street who's a total extrovert, and she was literally stand on the street, just waiting for people to walk past so that she could talk to them. So I think extroverts had a really hard time. So, and the temperament stuff is a big complex issue, but I guess the reason I'm bringing it up is that if you're a parent and you're dealing with kids who have CNX and trying to navigate through all of that complex stuff, the more you can really start to think about your kid's temperament and how he or she responds to stuff, the better. So there are all those things that are just super hard for little kids. And it wasn't until I was reading through some of the background stuff that has been sent through to me that you really start to think, man, this would be really hard if you're a little kid. You know, you go to a birthday party and everyone's chowing down on junk, and you can't have that particular junk. You know, for teenagers who are going out with their friends, you know, who are just eating whatever crap they can find to hand, but you can't have that stuff. That would be really, and that's just the food stuff, let alone the kind of the physical discomfort and the pain and symptoms and all of those things. So there's a whole lot of stuff that people have to kind of navigate your way through, but temperament's really important. Just that, stopping to really think about this little person that I'm raising, how do they do the world, and how are they with things like change, and how do they react to stuff, and how intensely do they feel things. And so when you can start to kind of incorporate that into how you work with your kids, the better it goes. So there are some kids that we kind of call sparky. They have a sparky temperament. They're just generally more energy, more work. They make more of a fuss about stuff. They make really interesting adults, but they're really hard work when they're kids. There are kids that we call kind of cruisy, which are those just what the name sounds. They're just kind of cruisy kids. They adapt to change pretty well. They take a no pretty well. They just deal with stuff pretty well. And then there are kids that are kind of more like a slow burner. So they tend to they adapt to change, but it takes them a little bit longer. They'll adapt to new situations, but it takes them a little bit longer. They sit back and they watch, and then they start to take part in things. And there's no good or bad temperament. They're all different, but understanding the one that you've got, that stuff is really important, because I mean, fundamentally, it seems to me the way that you kind of navigate your way through a lot of these issues with kids is the content's the same, but the how you do it is quite different. So it is about the educating kids about what's going on. Like it's going to be important for kids to understand stuff about T cells and antigens and immune systems and all that kind of stuff. You know, it should, rather than it just being a name of a thing. The more you can understand about the why the stuff happens, the better. There is the kind of validating of kids' feelings just around how much it sucks. You know, like it's really important to validate kids. It's like if you're upset about something, like something really terrible is happening, you're really upset about it, and someone just tries to cheer you up. That's just annoying a lot of the time. And so with kids, it's really important to validate their feelings of unfairness, and that at times they'll feel anxious and sad and angry and all of those sorts of things. And that just shows that they're a normal, functioning human being who's reacting to the stuff around them. So the validation is really important. But again, this is where temperament gets laid in on top, because some kids, when they get upset, they process that stuff talking to other people and being around other people, the extroverts. But if your kid's an introvert, that's not what they'll do. And so how an introvert processes things is they just need quiet time by themselves. And often that can worry parents, because they think, oh, my kid's isolating, you know, in her room, or he's isolating himself in his room. And there's a tendency to see that as being a bad thing, when actually it's just, that's how this little person processes stuff. Things get on top of them, and they just need to go somewhere quiet, and and have some quiet time just by themselves to recharge their batteries. So understanding those really basic things about how your kid deals with the stress of all of this is really important, so that you can help them to get what they need to recharge their batteries and not work against that stuff. And it's the as your kids are going out into the world, that there are the issue of they're going to have to kind of communicate for themselves to other people about celiacs and about their dietary requirements, and ask questions. And some kids are fine with that. They'll just kick in the door and say, "Where is my gluten-free pizza?" And other kids will be very quiet about it. They will find it a lot harder to say that stuff. So they will just sit there quietly and not eat rather than make a fuss about things. So it's always about working out who your kid is, and then helping them to deal with some of that stuff. I was thinking about how I would deal with this as a parent. It's like you kind of have to equip your kids with tools and with ways to explain this stuff to other people. So there was a great question. I love this question. It was how do you how do you politely tell someone thanks but no thanks to their unfounded advice about celiac disease, e.g., it's all in your head, homeopathy will fix it, try the power of prayer, one little bite of this gluten-filled food won't hurt? Because basically, your kids are going to have to go out in the world and deal with idiots. We all have to deal with idiots. It's a necessary concept. I was walking up the street the other day and there was this nice man with his kid. He was dropping off his kid for school. We were in the middle of a nice talk about how great it was that, the world was coming back online again. He said, "Yeah, but it was great during the lockdown. We were all vibrating at 70 hertz. There were no contrails from the jets. It was free." And I just thought, "Nah, you're a nutcase." And so then I just said, "Okay, then I'm gonna see you later, buddy. I'm just gonna walk on now." So you have to deal with it, and your kids are going to have to deal with that stuff. And so it's about, I think, equipping them with having ways to explain this stuff to people, and for them to kind of get. It's like you have to kind of teach your philosophy, or kids' philosophy. I was thinking about this. It's like to navigate the world as a little person when stuff happens to you, which is going to feel unfair all of the time. You're going to need a way to understand that, because if you don't, and what humans do is we tend to turn in on ourselves and it tends to go a bit bad. And so things like philosophy, I think, can be really useful. And there were, and sort of, it's interesting. I mean, philosophy now is seen as being this sort of pointy-headed academic thing that's not of much good to anyone. But actually, for ages, philosophers just thought about how to be human and told the rest of us so we didn't have to. And so Stoic philosophers, one of the great things about Stoic philosophy, Stoicism isn't just toughen up, don't express your feelings. One of the things that I think is particularly useful from that little school of philosophy is that what Stoics, at the heart of Stoicism, is this idea that if you can change things, change it, and if you can't, then don't waste your energy railing against it. That's a complex, complicated thing to really get, but for kids dealing with celiac stuff, they're gonna have to kind of make their peace with this idea, because it is hard enough dealing with the realities of it without also lumping in the psychological burden of the railing against something that you have control over diet, but you don't have control over whether or not you have celiacs or not. So giving kids a way to process their feelings about it so that they can focus their energies on the stuff that they can change. Like, I know it sucks that you go out with your friends and you can't eat all the stuff that they eat. That sucks, but it's like, you can sit there and focus in on how sucky that is, but all that does is it drains energy from you and it steals time away from you and your friends. So we've got to find some other way around that. So kind of finding ways to equip your kids with a way to make their peace with the unfairness of the stuff they're dealing with is really important. Giving them models to deal with people to talk about stuff. So, one of the examples was when maybe they're at their friend's place and someone's got a gluten-free pizza, but they're cutting it on the same base as the same board that someone's just cut, like a gluten what's the opposite of gluten-free? Is it gluten-filled? Is it gluten-packed? A gluten-packed pizza. So they cut their gluten-packed pizza, dripping their, gross little bits of gluten all over the board. And then they cut the gluten-free pizza on top of that. And you have to try and explain to people that that's not a thing. Fortunately, now people understand what cross-contamination is. And so if it was me, how I'd be explaining that to people that I was with, or how I'd get my kids to explain that, as I would say, well, when you have celiacs, gluten is kind of like COVID-19. So for us, it's COVID-19. And it would be like if you got someone who had coronavirus and you sat them on your chopping board, and then you got them off, and then you sat someone else who didn't have it on your chopping board, you wouldn't eat the second person because they could have coronavirus and you would then get it. So you just have to think about it like coronavirus. Like, we didn't shake hands with each other because of cross-contamination. It's the same thing. Viruses and gluten, they both get transmitted through contact, that kind of stuff. So that is kind of one of the nice things, I think, about the whole COVID stuff. Like, it gives you a model so that people can now get this idea of cross-contamination. Kids also have a way of feeling okay about making a fuss in restaurants, right? No, nobody wants to be that person in restaurants that's asking all the questions and looks like they're really high maintenance. And I think that's true if you're a high maintenance person. Like, if you're just an idiot person who's like, can I have an egg without egg in it? Or can I have an egg that's just been held suspended and just gently shaken just for a couple of seconds and then put back? Like, that person's annoying. But if you have a genuine reason for asking about stuff, then again, your kids have to have a way, and you have to have a way to feel okay about that. How I would, I'm going to swear a little bit because this is how I deal with life. This is how, if I had kids, this is how I would teach them to deal with if you get the stares from people in restaurant about making a fuss over ordering. I would turn to the people who you think are giving you the look and go, fuck you, I've got celiacs. So, that's why I'm doing this. They have to get a little bit fuck you, not in a mean or rude way, but you have to teach them, you don't have to feel bad about the stuff. You don't have to feel bad about the fact you're with people and they think that you're making a fuss. It's like in your head, you just go, fuck you, I've got celiacs. I'm just going to ask my damn questions. It's a reasonable question. Shut up. Like, there is kind of some of that. Now, you may not be comfortable with actually saying that, and I'm not saying that you would say that. I think you have to say that to kind of the snotty, rude people. I think it's completely fine in that situation. But I think internally you've got to teach your kids to say, look, it doesn't matter about that stuff. What you're doing is reasonable. What you're asking is reasonable. So you have to train yourself to kind of feel okay about that. And then over and above all of that, it's all of the things that people say. The reason that people talk about the same things a lot all the time is because this stuff works. It's like depression and anxiety are a big problem for us as a country generally, particularly after the whole COVID-19 thing. In some ways, if you weren't on the verge of depression or anxiety during that, you were not paying attention to what was kind of going on. So those things are an issue for kind of everyone. How you deal with that stuff is the same for everyone. So it is things like, trying to exercise. It is things like trying to practice gratitude, to be grateful for the things that you have. It's things like mindfulness. So having an approach to life, which is that you just you kind of notice things without judging it. I've got my father-in-law worked in pain management for a long time, and he worked in a pain clinic. He was an anaesthetist, and he said, like a huge percentage of pain is psychology. So there were a lot of clinical psychologists that work with people in pain clinics to help them manage chronic pain. And mindfulness techniques, those sorts of things, meditation can be really useful for that stuff. So dealing with chronic and long-term discomfort, you are going to have to find ways to kind of deal with that. And mindfulness is just a really, really useful way to deal with that stuff. Exercise, it's irritating that exercise is so good for you, because I wish it was the opposite. I wish the truth was that actually, all you have to do is watch telly endlessly and you'll feel better, but you don't. Exercise is good for you. So it's all of those practical things. So it's it's doing those basic practical things that kind of everybody says and talks about. It's self-compassion is hugely important, like teaching your kids self-compassion, being compassionate to yourself. There are times when you will just feel terrible. There are times when you will feel tired and uncomfortable and in pain, and it won't feel fair and it will suck. And you just have to be okay with sometimes being like that and not beating yourself up for having those moments where you kind of fall over and everything is bad. So self-compassion, hugely important. Working with your kids' temperament, try and understand how they process and see the world, and working with that stuff. You know, extroverts and introverts are going to deal with celiacs very differently. An intense kid versus a less intense kid going to deal with the stuff very differently. Parenting a kid who is really persistent, which is the nice way of saying stubborn, very different parenting a persistent kid through something like CNX versus a kid who's less persistent, because a kid who's less persistent just goes, oh yeah, okay. Whereas the more persistent kid, they're a lot harder work. So understanding that stuff is really important. Now, what I really wanted to do though was to go through people's questions and right, any special advice to older? Yeah, okay. So, a question from Bill. The majority of celiacs are diagnosed later in life, 40s, 50s, 60s. Any special advice for the elders who suddenly have to adjust to new life, have to re-educate their friends around them, work functions, sports clubs, etc., etc., etc.? Yeah, Bill, I think it's like anything, any major life. Like humans, we're not actually that great at change. We for most of human history, we didn't make it past about 15, to be honest, for most of human history. Like, you made it to about 13, you had babies, and then a saber-toothed tiger ate you. So we weren't used to being around for this long for a start, and we're certainly not used to the amount of change that we have to endure. And so change is not something that comes naturally to us. But I guess one of the benefits, and this was a strange thing, one of the benefits of getting celiac later in life is that you've got a whole lot of life experience, you're older, you've learned some things along the way, and it's easier to get your head around some of those really important but actually kind of complex things, like philosophical approaches to dealing with difficulty, and mindfulness, and this idea of self-compassion, the acceptance of the fact that it's easier to so you go out for friends and it's like the 5th time you've tried to explain to them about the celiac stuff and they still haven't got it. When you're 14, you might think, oh, my friends don't care about me, they all hate me. And it's like, no, they're just humans and useless, and they just don't get stuff. And actually, you're just going to have to explain this stuff to them again. And so I think the advantage that you have later in life is that you have more kind of life experience you can bring to bear. And you can really apply yourself to understanding some of those philosophical principles, because the truth is that dealing with adversity is about attitude, not that nauseating, think positive, I'm a tiger stuff, because that's just annoying. But you make decisions about how you respond to the world. You can't decide you often have no control over the things that happen to you, but you do have control over how you respond to those things. And that's a thing that people have talked about for thousands of years, in all honesty. And philosophers have talked about it, and Buddhists talk about it, psychologists talk about it, because it's true. You don't control often the things that happen to you, but you do control your response to it. And your response to the thing and the judgments and the attributions that you make about that thing can really impact how you feel. And so if you respond to the bad thing that's happened by saying, why do these things always happen to me, and now everything is terrible and it's all ruined, and this is the worst thing ever. Another great thing the Stoics do is they're very careful about language, and we're not. We spray language. We say everything is awesome. Well, how was that? I don't know. How was your trip? That was awesome. Was it awesome? Like, you went to Hamilton and back. Like, Hamilton's cool. Like, I get it, but Was it genuinely awesome? Like, was it like, you know, standing on Mount Everest looking out over the world awesome, or was it just pretty good? And that stuff's fine, but when we say everything is terrible, how was it? Oh, it was terrible. It's the worst thing that's ever happened. It's a complete disaster, blah, 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 blah. Mostly it's not true. You know, mostly it's not the worst thing that's ever happened to you, or it's not terrible, it's annoying, or it's, how was it? It was just awful. Was it awful, or was it just uncomfortable? So language really matters. And so I try to be careful about the language that I use to describe things, because words shape your brain. So if someone says, how is this thing? And you go that it's terrible, your brain goes click and it loads up a bunch of stuff around terrible. So being careful and measured in how you talk about things is important. Being conscious in the attributions that you make about the world is important. Being more accepting of the fact that, you know, people are great, but people are idiots. Do you know what I mean? It's like people say, is this gluten free? Oh yeah, it's totally, yeah. Are you sure? Because I really no, it's totally, there's no gluten in there. And then they bring out this thing, and it's basically just a big bowl of gluten. You go, so the kind of being accepting of the less than perfectness of humans generally is really important. Do I need to give my 9-year-old daughter any? I'm assuming that's not a question to me. Do I need to get? I'm not sure that I can answer questions around iron supplements. So I'm going. No, and it's a medical question. So I'm going to go back to my other questions. Oh, it's quite a good one. So, tips on how a shy child or adult can learn to have the courage to advocate for themselves in a social setting. It's kind of what I was talking about just before. That you need to. It's not something I think New Zealanders, like a lot of us aren't particularly good at that. I've never complained at a restaurant. You know, when they come over and they say, how's the meal? I've never, ever complained. You know, just never. I've never said, oh, that's, the beans are a bit stringy. Because I just think, I don't care enough to complain. But there are times when you have to do stuff. So in my normal everyday life, I avoid conflict like the plague. I will lie. I will pay false compliments. I will say that I'm fine with stuff, but I'm not, because you know what? I just don't want the conflict. But when I have to do conflict, when it's work, I consciously shift gear. So if I'm at work, and I'm talking to, in days gone by, I'll be talking to clients or working with families, and we have to talk about difficult stuff. My job was to talk about difficult stuff. And so I consciously said to myself, all right, put your hat on now and do your stuff. And so I think it is that. I think that what you have to do is you have to, in your own mind, make a role that you can assume when you have to have those conversations. And so if you treat those conversations, and they're important conversations where you need to communicate information to people and find out quite specific stuff from them, and often people won't have an understanding of what a gluten-free diet really means, and they won't have an understanding about celiac. And so they are going to give probably some vague answers that don't quite answer stuff, and you're just going to keep pressing to find stuff out. So what you can't do is treat those conversations as a normal conversation. What you should do is, for you, and I think for kids who are dealing with the stuff, you have to come up with a way for them to transition, or for you to transition into that role. And it's a detective role, or it's a scientist role, or it's something like that, or it's a, think about myself as a medical specialist role. And when I'm in this role, there are some quite specific things that I'm doing. So I'm not having a normal everyday conversation. I'm not like, oh, did you want to, come to a barbecue? Yeah, I'd love to come to your barbecue. And it's like, no, I don't want to come to your barbecue, but I'm going to come just because I don't quite know how to say I don't want to come to your barbecue. We all get into that stuff. But you need to kind of have that role, a hat that you put on, or a shift that you make in your mind, which is, okay, now I'm just, for the next 5 minutes, I'm going to stop being social me, and I'm going to shift into fact finding me, and I'm going to nail down exactly what is happening with this thing right now. Because if I don't, then it's going to be super bad for me. And so that's why I'm going to make that shift. So if it were me, I would be thinking about it like that. If I had kids dealing with this stuff, I'd be teaching them like that. If I was dealing with CNX myself, I would do that in my head, because I would have to go from never complaining to asking a million questions, because if I didn't, then the repercussions for me would be really terrible. So it is about, don't be the normal you. That probably won't work if you don't find it easy to do that stuff. Shift into a specific role. And it's like, okay, for the next 5 minutes, I'm not going to be me. I'm going to be fact-finding me. I'm going to find stuff out, and I'm going to ask all these questions, and I'm going to do it politely. I'm not going to be rude, but I'm not going to get upset if this person gets annoyed. It's not their fault they're annoyed. They just don't understand why it's important. And so I'll do my best to try and explain to them why it's important, because that will help them to feel less upset, and it will mean that the next time someone is asking them these questions, they might understand why it's so important. But if they do get upset, fundamentally, this isn't my problem. I'm now fact-finding me. So I think that idea about having a very specific role, rather than just don't be you asking these questions, or if you've got kids who aren't great at that stuff, so look, you don't be you got to be fact-finding you. You can't just be normal kind of everyday, not make a fuss you. You've got to be fact-finding you. I think we've covered off the homeopathy. Homeopathy is great. I love when people come up with the homeopathy solutions. It's like, yeah. Here's what I think, and this is just a purely personal opinion. There is no psychology behind this. This is just utterly 100% personal, not backed up by any research, just me. I think if someone imposes their unrequested homeopathy advice on you, you have every right to be completely disparaging and slightly mocking of their views. Like, I'm fine with it. It's like, if you're a homeopathy club and I walk in and start having a go at you people for your homeopathy beliefs, that's not all right, because, everyone's entitled to believe in fairy tales and magic and, things like that, talking weasels. But if you impose your madness on me, then I have a right to mock you mercilessly because you asked for it. That's probably not what a good human would do, but that's kind of, I just find that stuff annoying. Right. How to manage anxiety of siblings of children with managing worry, that we'll get it too. Right. So there is the broader thing about managing the impact of this on the family more generally. And again, and I feel like most of my life now is harping on about temperament, but it's about, with kids, it's about understanding how they work and how they see the world and working with that stuff. And then it's about giving them information. And then it's about just saying, look, I get that the stuff is hard. And then it's about talking to them about, well, let's focus on the things that we can manage. Like, what are the things that we can do right now? Like, what we know is that it's possible that this is something that could happen to you, but it's possible that it might not happen to you. You might get, I don't know, you might get picked by an ostrich which escapes from a zoo. Like, there are a bunch of things that could happen, but let's deal with things how they are now. So managing stuff generally within the family, I think, is just about, again, it's about temperament, and it's about pitching information at a level that kids kind of want and need. And then it is about kind of moving on and not maintaining a focus on the stuff and making it the center of everything. And just the other thing that I would say, in terms of family and kids and diet and stuff, that, and this is probably a dad thing, because if you've got kids and they're dealing with the stuff, you've got teenagers and they're dealing with the stuff, let them have as much of the shitty, good gluten-free stuff as you can. It's like, you can have, like I was looking in the magazine, so the How's Pizza do the gluten-free stuff, and I saw there's gluten-free chips and that kind of stuff. If your kids have to deal with the extra kind of pressures of CNX, then as much as you can, find the safe stuff that they can have and let them have that. Don't, if you've got a you got an 11-year-old is dealing with the stuff, and it's like, well, we can have as much vegetables as we want, or a house pizza that's gluten free. Then don't impose extra health. Don't go any more than you have to. Mums struggle with this because dads, we're like, it's fun, like we're much more relaxed about that stuff. But it's like, and I know that there's the financial burden that places on families too, because a lot of that gluten-free stuff, it's a lot more expensive to have that stuff. But just as a parent, just work really hard to make sure that you are doing everything you can in terms of educating your kids and the good diet and everything else. But where you can, do as much as you can. Now, right. How best to deal? How are we going for time, Wendy? I've sort of lost track of time. It's this weird Zoom thing. You just sit in your room and talk. Like we could still be here the day after tomorrow, be going, what the hell? When's he going to stop? Like it's been 2 days. See, Wendy's unmuted, but I can't hear Wendy say anything.
We're all good for time, Nigel. Doing good. We've got a question in the Q&A section as well as in the chat, just letting you know.
Right, let me just find the Q&A section. Oh, there we are. No, where's it gone? Oh, it's over there on the other screen. Drag it across. Right. Thanks for your down-to-earth presentation. You're very welcome. How do you recommend we deal with the fear and anxiety and uncertainty that is pervading the world due to COVID-19? Right. Well, so yeah. I think what's happening in the world at the moment is, and I was talking with a friend of mine, Natalie Flynn, about this, who's also a psychologist. It's almost like it kind of feels like in some ways the pressure is starting to lift a little bit because we're back at level 1. People going for drives notwithstanding. But there is a great deal of anxiety out there in the world. And also now we're kind of coming out into the second part of this thing, which is that we've dealt with the immediate health stuff, but now we're dealing with the economic impacts of all of the stuff. And so there are a lot more pressures that will come on to people now. So a lot of people have lost jobs, and a lot of businesses are really struggling. And a lot of people who thought they were fine have discovered that they're kind of not, and things are really difficult. What you have to do, I think, is first off accept that it's actually pretty normal for everyone to be a bit anxious and stressed right now. It's normal for people to have freakouts about stuff. I think if you were going through lockdown and didn't have the occasional freakout, you just weren't paying attention. I kind of had 2 significant ones, mostly around reading opinion pieces about the economic fallout of all of this, which made you think the world was going to end. So some of it is, I guess, avoiding news and avoiding stuff that kind of makes you feel bad. But the basics of how you deal with anxiety and stress and all those sorts of things are still the same. It is about exercise. It is about trying to eat as healthily as you can. Sleep is important. One of the things I think, like a simple thing that you can do is, and I think it's true of COVID, but also I think of dealing with celiac stuff as well. There are times when you adjust, everything is going to feel too much and too complex and overwhelming. And human brains are amazing. Our ability to deal with information is just astounding. But we do become overwhelmed by stuff, and we can get too much information, and we do get tired, and we do shut down. And so dealing with something just feels too big and too complex and too overwhelming, then one of the simplest things is just to start shrinking down the thing that you're dealing with until you get to something that you can do. And it's something that I learned years ago working really complicated clinical cases, would work with really complicated families with just enormously complicated stuff going on. The big problem was too much, and I literally had no idea what to do about that. So I would just start focusing in until I found a small thing that I could actually do something about. And I think that's true of dealing with COVID stuff. I think it's true of dealing with celiac. I think it's true of dealing with almost any problem that you have in life. If you're becoming overwhelmed, stop, take a breath, step back and find a smaller bit of it and just keep making it smaller until you get to something that you can do. And maybe the thing that you do is you just go, you know what? I feel tired and I feel stressed, and today's going to be a bad day and I'm going to feel sorry for myself and it's just going to suck. and then you sleep and you wake up the next day and you feel better. Sometimes the best thing to do is just to go, this day's I'm gonna call this day. It's like this is just gonna be a crap day. I'm just gonna feel terrible today. And then you sleep and you wake up and you have another go the next day. If you've got big decisions to make, big problems, don't do that stuff at the end of the day. If you're because we do get a thing called decision fatigue, right? So as we become more tired, it's harder for us to make decisions, and we do feel more stressed, and all of that stuff is more difficult. So, kind of do that stuff earlier in the day when you're feeling better. If you're feeling stressed and anxious as the day is going along, then it is about doing those simple things. It's about things like mindfulness. It's about going for a walk. It's funny, walking is one of those things that there's some really complicated neuroscience behind why things like walking are really good for us. So often, most people probably had that experience of, I don't know, maybe you're just walking, or you're, doing the aimless shower turn in the morning, and you suddenly have an idea about how to fix a problem that you were dealing with. And that's the reason that happens, is because when we're doing nothing, when we're just coasting along, when we're just cruising, some quite specific things happen in our brains, and some hubs start to hum effectively that connect really important parts of our brain. So doing nothing is actually really important. And that's why, if things are getting on top of you, then just build on some time to do nothing. Meditation is good, but going for a walk is really good. Maybe you get out to your local pool's opening up again. I don't know. Whatever you do, just to kind of cruise along. So for me, it's about accepting that it's a bunch of things, really. It's like, I think part of the problem with the world now is social media and magazines make it look like there are people who've got it sorted. And so we look at people's social media feeds, and we read their books, and we look at these magazine articles, and we think, there are humans who've really got this stuff sorted, and they've perfected parenting and their careers and happiness and success and everything else. So it's like, no, most of those people are lying. Most of us are kind of messy, just straggling along. Most of us have times when actually life's a bit shitty. I always think it's hilarious that one of the things I think people, if I go to conferences, people come up to me and they go, your life must be so interesting, and amazing, doing all these interesting things. They go, no, not really. Like, because it's not. It's like, 2 nights ago, this happens a lot. I was out kind of in the rain picking up dog poo because they're just not random, not in a weird way. Like, that's, what? No, like our own dog, not just out at night in the rain, just randomly picking up random dog poo. No, this was in our yard because the lawn guy was coming the next day and I had to leave early. And so I thought, I can't leave it on the lawn. So I'm just out there in the, rain, picking up dog poo in a bag with my little head torch on. And it's like, that's my actual human life. I kind of wish people would post more pictures of their actual life, because your actual life, as you go to the kitchen, it's like, no one's done the freaking dishes. You open up the fridge and it's like, we have no milk. It's like, I can't get that. You go to drive your car out and someone's put their bins over the front of your drive. Like, that's an actual lived human life. And so for me, what it's about is just don't be under the illusion that anyone else's life isn't filled with those things, because even people whose lives look like they're really together, because none of us know the sort of pressures that people have going on, the financial pressures, the kind of the health pressures, all of that stuff. So it is about just not measuring ourselves against this perceived perfect other thing. It's about accepting that life isn't perfect. It's about accepting that we all have shitty days, that actually life is really unfair. It's like, if you think life should be fair, you're going to be constantly disappointed, and that's why I do think things like philosophy actually still have a lot to offer us, because the world that we live in is now very much there's some technology to fix everything. That's just not how it is. So I think teaching your kids things like philosophy really important. Teaching them not to rail against the unfairness of the world, really important. Teaching them to accept, the Buddha stuff, that life is suffering. It's a really simple idea, but if you kind of really wrap your head around it, it's terribly freeing, because there are people who think life shouldn't be suffering, and so they get angry about every little thing that happens to them. And it's like, well, but that's the cost of being a human. It just is. You're going to get stuck in traffic. You're going to run out of milk. You're going to have these things are going to happen. So teaching your kids, teaching yourself these things. And if you are, later in life, and suddenly all of this has been piled in upon you, it's things like this. There's a great book, The Obstacle is the Way. It's by this guy called Ryan Holiday. It's basically about Stoic philosophy and this old Roman emperor, someone. And it's not that nauseating just to always look on the bright side of life stuff, because that's annoying. It's what it talks about is a way of approaching obstacles and problems and difficulties, because every life is full of it. My life is a constant series of obstacles because of a human who exists in the world. So, if I had kids, I'd be teaching them some of this kind of stuff. If it was me dealing with this stuff later in life, there are lots of things out there that you can go and find and read to help you to get your head around dealing with the reality of where you are. Now, are there any more questions? Or it's this weird Zoom thing that it's literally, sometimes it feels like it's literally just you sitting in your little room talking to. At least you guys have your screens on, which is good. I've done somewhere like there's just 50 dark screens, and you think, are you there? This is just some trick that people have played to get me to talk to myself in my room. It seems like there are medical questions which are well beyond.
That was awesome, Nigel. So you've answered all the questions that we sent to you previously?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, I think the main thing is how people can deal with their anxiety and build resilience and get some tools in their toolbox to deal with things, make them smaller and get more resilient. So,
and a large part of that, I think, is about, you have to get a philosophy of how you approach this and deal with it. So you have to find a way to make your peace with CNX, how you incorporate that into the reality of your life. And then it is doing those old tried and trusted things that people talk about all the time. Mindfulness, really, really useful. Doing exercise, really, really useful. Stress, all those stress things. Having organizations like this, really important. Connecting up with and talking to other people is hugely important. As humans, we're made to connect with other people. And so there is a reason why organizations like this are really helpful to people. It's because you feel you're with people who are the same, and you can choose to. And just that simple fact of connecting up with other people like you is hugely valuable.
Yeah, not feeling different from. It's amazing.
Yeah, and there were some lovely stories in the magazines about, you have to also remember too, about the kindness of people. So some lovely stories about kids who went to birthday parties, and it wouldn't have been the dads, because the dads wouldn't have done this, but the mums made an entirely gluten-free birthday party. Like, that's a lovely thing. And so people are lovely. It is just about, I think, trying to educate people and get people to understand it. Because one of the things that we've seen, I think, very clearly over the last little while, is that when people understand a problem, they will help. That's what we do. Every time there is a problem, people help people. So the more people understand about celiac, and the more people understand what the reality is like for kids who have it, the more they will help. I'd never stop to think about what it would be like for a little kid who's got celiac coming along to a birthday party. But if we were still in the birthday party business now, and thank goodness that we're not, I would totally do that. I would totally have a gluten-free birthday party, because you just know it's going to make that little kid feel a lot nicer. And that's, I don't think that's just me. I just think if more, the more people get it, the more people who understand it, the more that stuff will change.
Yeah. And also people later in life, in their 40s, 50s and 60s, talking about their lived experiences that help them build that ability to cope with change was important too. So thank you very much for being our guest speaker today. we've got a couple of questions that are for medically based, so we'll have our medical advisory panel respond to those.
I think it's best.
Yeah, but but yeah, it was really good. Your style of communicating is really open and inclusive. It's great. So thank you very much, Nigel.
Right. Well, have a night. Well, at least the annual general meeting's over, so now it's just the good stuff. So I will. I shall leave you all to it. And I have to say, I have personally, just in terms of finding out more about celiac, has been really, really useful for me. So it's stuff that I will be kind of going away, and I do a lot of parenting talks, and I'm going to be. I love that story of the celiac birthday party. Like, I love that, and so I'll be using that as an example when I talk to kind of large audiences about, like, this is just stuff to think about, because it's like it's your kids, you're modeling to your kids about helping other people. So it's been a very useful exercise for me as well. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. And using your platform to raise awareness about celiac is great for us too. So thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Okay. See you later. So, do you want to
We're handing over to
Andrew and Simon?
Cool. So we'll just hand over to Andrew and Simon to answer some of those medical questions.
So we've got Andrew Day on the line, as well as Simon Chin here. One of the questions that's come through is, do I need to give my celiac 9-year-old daughter any iron supplements or do blood tests to check for vitamin D levels? She was diagnosed as a 2-year-old.
So Simon here. Sorry, I don't remember your daughter. But in our primary practice here in that Starship in Auckland is that if you're diagnosed with celiac disease, generally once you go gluten-free, your child's iron levels should start to return to normal. As the intestinal lining heals, your absorption of nutrients such as iron and calcium should become normal. So in normal circumstances with a child with celiac disease newly diagnosed, I wouldn't normally be suggesting iron supplementation. There might be some children with their initial blood testing might suggest that they're anemic, and if the GP had done iron studies, blood iron levels, that showed that they were low, then perhaps treatment initially with, say, 2 months of iron supplement might be beneficial, but not long term, because once the intestinal lining is healed, you wouldn't normally expect to carry on requiring iron or vitamin D supplements. I don't know, Andrew, with you, because you're down south, there's probably higher levels of low vitamin D levels, so whether you suggest anything different.
Thanks, Simon. Yes, Andrew Day here. I very much agree, Simon. Key thing is assessing those micronutrients at baseline, at diagnosis, supplementing if need be. But in the vast majority, once the mucosa is healed, once the lining's healed, we should get normal absorption of those micronutrients. Ongoing low levels may suggest not having optimal adherence to gluten-free diet, not having optimal healing, or other reasons. But yeah, iron, B12, folate, vitamin D are key things, although I don't think I've ever seen a child with low B12 or folate. So I think it's probably more of an adult issue than a pediatric issue. But the others very much so.
There's a question from Paula. This relates to the current COVID-19 situation and whether are there perhaps disproportionate numbers of patients with celiac disease who have caught this virus compared with, say, others, and are they at more risk of getting COVID-19 complications due to the fact that celiac disease is an autoimmune condition? Andrew, I don't know if you've, certainly amongst some other gastrointestinal conditions where the immune system has been affected, like inflammatory bowel disease, we're not seeing a particularly high number of children with, say, inflammatory bowel disease that have severe infection from COVID-19. Also bear in mind too that with COVID-19 infection, the number of children who actually get this infection is relatively low compared with those teenagers, adolescents, younger adults and the elderly, of course, who have probably a far higher portion of those getting COVID-19 infection. I don't know about celiac disease itself, Andrew. I haven't seen it come through, but maybe you have some information.
So yes, there's been international collaborations to try and get an idea of what happens with this infection in people with inflammatory bowel disease, with celiac disease, with liver disease, and so on. But certainly, and I haven't seen the most recent data in terms of celiac disease, and I'm not involved in that data collection, but what I understand is that relatively small numbers of people with celiac disease have had infection, and certainly not a risk factor for severe infection. There's an initiative based from the people in Ontario and Canada, international initiative, and that's looked now at more than 10,000 people with celiac disease in terms of how they feel about the infection, what are they worried about with the infection, and so on. And thanks very much for the members that have contributed to that data from New Zealand, but it's Australia, New Zealand, Canada, US, Brazil, and a number of other countries. And that's going to be really helpful in terms of getting an idea about how people feel about this infection. Because clearly in New Zealand, we're doing pretty well, but I was just looking at the figures today, and things are still accelerating upwards in many parts of the world, and we need to count our lucky stars really in terms of where we are at the moment compared to the rest of, to many other countries in the world.
So there's another question here from Mary, and that it says, are there any plans for an annual or a regular check for celiac disease patients in New Zealand like there is in the UK? I guess I can only speak for children in Auckland, and that generally we are recommending that GPs check annually children with celiac disease, so that's assessing their if they have any residual symptoms, how they comply with the gluten-free diet, getting weight and height, etc. They may be due for a follow-up blood test to make sure that their celiac antibodies has started to return to normal. Just a little bit about the annual check in terms of blood testing. There have been initial thoughts that the celiac antibodies, once they have been diagnosed with celiac disease and gone gluten-free, that there should be normalization of your celiac antibodies within a year, but there's more recent data over the past 2 years now that the antibodies could be still mildly positive or at low levels, even up to kind of 2 years post your diagnosis. I can't speak for the adults who have celiac disease. I'm not sure whether there's a recommendation about annual blood testing. Andrew?
I mean, so Mary had referred to the UK, and there's a number of international guidelines from the US, from Europe, from the UK, and they vary substantially in terms of what they suggest in terms of the ongoing follow-up, and there's not really any international consensus about that. And part of that is because nobody's got the data or the studies to be able to say it. So it's experts' opinion. But having an annual review, having a regular review with your GP is certainly appropriate, and those international guidelines do certainly focus upon that for adults as well as for children.
Thanks very much, Andrew and Simon, for your contribution there. There was one question about the submission to government mid last year around identifying medicines, and we did put a submission in August 2019, but there's been no further word on that. And then the question from Mary about the MPI work on issues with food labelling, that's an ongoing discussion that we're having. The issues are that some ingredients come in from overseas as bulk ingredients, and then they get tested to the FSANZ standard when they get packaged. But if they're not tested each batch and they're repackaged in a facility that may have gluten in it, then the recommendation from MPI is quite often to put may contain. So that's an ongoing discussion that we're involved in regularly. So I think that's all the questions answered that were on the chat and the Q&A. There's nothing you want to add, Simon or Andrew, from a medical perspective?
No. So just to speak for Nigel Latta, it's great to see that previously there's been a lot of emphasis on the medical aspects and the dietary aspects of celiac disease. So it's really good to see how the society has evolved and considered the mental and the psychosocial aspects of the disease. It's a great initiative.